He was shoved out of his seat, accused of smelling bad, and told, without shame, to prove he belonged up front. No shouting, no scene, just the kind of humiliation that's practiced, polished, and quiet. A black man, dressed sharper than anyone on board, treated like luggage that got misplaced in first class. But here's what no one realized. They didn't just disrespect a passenger, they provoked a reckoning. Because the man they tried to erase is the very person their careers, their comfort, and their future depend on. This flight? It isn't about turbulence. It's about truth. Watch closely, because the ones who laugh now won't be smiling when this plane lands. If this story dares you to think deeper, comment below. What would you do in his place? Tell us where you're watching from. And if you're ready for the fallout, subscribe. This series isn't just drama, it's a mirror. Deshaun Givens walked with purposeful calm through gate B14, his leather duffel slung neatly over one shoulder, polished Oxfords clicking softly against the tile. The morning was cool, and the Denver terminal hummed with quiet order. He had been through dozens of airports, hundreds of flights, but today had a strange stillness to it, the kind that brushes against the back of your neck like a warning. He approached the first-class boarding lane with his pass in hand. Seat 2A, booked a month in advance for the red-eye to DC, non-refundable, full fare. The attendant at the gate, a tall brunette with a name badge that read Lindsay, looked up just as he handed her the boarding pass. Her eyes skimmed the paper, then scanned him, pausing. Something flickered behind her professional expression. She didn't smile. She didn't greet him. Instead, she asked if he was sure he was at the right gate. He answered plainly. She studied the barcode a beat too long before asking him to step aside for what she called a routine re-verification. As she tapped something into her tablet, the line behind him swelled. A man in cargo shorts and a baseball cap stepped up next, barely holding his phone out before Lindsay waved him through without question. Another woman in yoga pants with a stroller breezed past him into first class. Still, Lindsay tapped. Still, Deshaun waited. She finally handed him the pass, with a tight-lipped nod and a muttered confirmation. But instead of clearing the lane, she motioned toward a metal post near the entrance and told him to stand aside, saying they needed to board others before the area got congested. Deshaun glanced around. The jet bridge was mostly empty. The bottleneck she referred to did not exist. He looked at her face, but there was nothing to read. Just a flat wall of politeness polished razor-sharp. He stepped aside. A line of passengers shuffled forward. Some stole glances. A few eyes lingered a little longer. No one said anything. Once the boarding group thinned, Lindsay waved him through without ceremony. No welcome. No thank you. Just a curt gesture. Deshaun walked down the jet bridge in silence, his body tight with restraint. He entered the aircraft and turned left into the premium cabin, where soft jazz trickled from unseen speakers and the scent of citrus cleaner clung to leather upholstery. The flight attendant stationed at the door, a woman in her late 30s with honey blonde hair, looked up from her manifest. Her eyes met his, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She greeted the man just ahead of him with an enthusiastic welcome and a light touch on the arm. When Deshaun handed her his boarding pass, she gave it a quick glance and then raised her brows slightly. Her voice was friendly but clipped. She didn't offer assistance. She didn't call him by name. She pointed toward his seat and moved on. Deshaun found 2A without issue, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and sat. The window view was clear, sky overcast but calm. He tried to relax, but something gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had been here before, this quiet hostility wrapped in professionalism. A man in 2C, white early 50s, khakis and sweater vest, glanced over, then leaned slightly across the aisle. He asked whether Deshaun worked for the airline, maybe security. Before Deshaun could respond, the man nodded to himself, satisfied with the idea. Probably IT, he said. You guys keep these planes from falling out of the sky, right? Deshaun offered a polite half-smile and turned back toward the window. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks. She offered champagne to the couple across from him and a mimosa to the man beside him. When she reached Deshaun, she hesitated. Her voice lowered a fraction. She asked whether he'd prefer orange juice or just water, gesturing vaguely at the row behind him. When he requested the same drink the others were having, she paused, blinked, then said they were low on that selection, but she'd see what she could do. She returned with warm water in a plastic cup. Deshawn took it without comment. No lemon, no napkin, no apology. As boarding continued, a young white woman in expensive athleisure stopped beside his seat. She looked confused, though outwardly composed. Inside, he was still cataloging the signs, the subtle deflections, the withheld courtesies, the way every smile aimed in his direction came just a second too late or not at all. He had flown enough to know that first class was not about money alone. It was about belonging, and today he did not. Without warning, a new figure entered the cabin, wearing a navy blazer with a silver badge identifying him as ground operations. The man, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and pale, stepped directly to Deshawn's seat with no glance at the manifest, no smile, no question. His voice was firm and sterile as he asked Deshawn to step out for a moment to confirm a discrepancy. Confused but controlled, Deshawn looked down at his boarding pass, then back up. The seat number still matched. 2A. There was no discrepancy. Yet the man remained, waiting, impassive. His request, now an instruction. Deshawn slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, sliding his carry-on out from beneath the seat. He moved into the aisle without resistance, though a faint tightening formed at the edge of his jaw. He stood aside, watching as the man said something into a small headset clipped to his collar. Moments later, an older white couple appeared at the front of the cabin. The woman wore a beige cashmere shawl and oversized sunglasses despite the dim lighting, and her husband, tall, thin, slightly stooped, carried a folded newspaper and a scowl of entitlement. Without checking passes or exchanging pleasantries, the flight attendant waved them forward, gesturing with a soft urgency toward the seat Deshawn had just vacated. They moved past him, ignoring his presence entirely, settling into 2A and 2C as if arriving late to a reservation at their favorite restaurant. Their luggage was handled with practiced grace, a fresh glass of chilled champagne handed over before they had even buckled in. Deshawn stood in the aisle, holding his bag, unmoving. The man in the blazer turned to him again and explained flatly that seat 2A had been reassigned due to a prioritization adjustment. Deshawn replied, his voice low but deliberate, that he had paid full fare, booked in advance, and held the proper assignment. The man gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't touch his eyes and repeated that adjustments sometimes happened without warning, especially when accommodating loyalty tier customers. Loyalty tier. The words hung in the air like an insult disguised as policy. Deshawn remained silent for a beat too long. The attendant watching nearby shifted her weight, anxious for the interaction to end. The man's voice hardened slightly, no longer patient, now mechanical. He pointed down the aisle toward the remaining seats in the back half of the cabin. Deshawn said nothing, but his shoulders drew tighter. He scanned the cabin for a flight supervisor. No one emerged. The nearest crew member averted her gaze. Passengers who had overheard leaned back into their newspapers, their earbuds, their silence. When Deshawn asked where his new seat was, the man responded vaguely that it would be assigned at the front of the main cabin. Not business class. Not a seat near the exit. Main cabin. That meant row 18 or higher. Deshawn stood there for another moment. Then quietly he moved. No protest. No demand. He walked the narrow aisle with long, restrained steps, feeling eyes flick toward him and then away like shutters closing over guilt. He passed row after row, each step compressing the frustration gathering beneath his skin. He placed his bag into the overhead bin above row 21, where his new seat awaited him, middle seat, between a teenager chewing gum loudly and a man already asleep with his head tilted into the aisle. He sat down slowly, adjusting his suit jacket, placing his elbows tightly against his ribs to avoid contact. The seat was smaller, the space colder, the insult deliberate. Overhead, the light blinked as the captain began his welcome announcement. Deshawn didn't hear the words. He watched the curtain separating first class slide shut. He stared blankly at the seatback screen in front of him, the plastic edges slightly chipped, the resolution lower than it had been in first class. His suit, once crisp, now clung stiffly to his arms, having no space to move freely. The man beside him, still dozing, leaned in closer with each tilt of turbulence, while the teenager to his left watched an action movie with a volume too high and elbows that spilled well into Deshawn's narrow territory. But none of that bothered him more than the silence. Not a word from the flight crew since he had been relocated. No water offered, no menu, no napkin, no greeting, as if his request for dignity had somehow forfeited his right to basic hospitality. He had watched the same attendant who once dismissed his drink order in first class, now move through coach with elaborate warmth. She bent slightly to smile at the older couple in 19A and B, adjusted a blanket for the mother with an infant in 20C, and offered a wine list to the man in 22A. When she finally reached his row, her tone cooled. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes flicked over him as if confirming something she already knew. Without a word, she pushed the cart past, leaving behind only a weak draft and the smell of roasted vegetables. Deshawn watched her go, jaw tight. He pressed the call button above him. The small yellow light blinked once, steady. 5 minutes passed. The light remained. 10 minutes. Still no response. Eventually, it dimmed automatically, unanswered. Across the aisle, a man raised his hand for coffee and received it within seconds, with cream and a biscuit. When Deshawn tried again, this time waving lightly as the attendant walked by, she paused, looked at him, and said with mechanical neutrality, "We'll be with you shortly." She did not return. The dryness in his throat grew sharp, but he refused to ask a third time. Instead, he folded his hands tightly in his lap and forced himself to remain still, to occupy as little space as possible in a world determined to pretend he wasn't there. When the second cart passed by, a different crew member now in charge, he finally received a brief glance and a short, transactional tone. "Meal preference?" the woman asked, already holding a plastic tray in one hand. Deshawn responded that he had requested the grilled option online during check-in. The woman frowned, tapping at a handheld device. Her voice dropped into a mutter. "Looks like that wasn't recorded." She held out a different tray, pasta, prepackaged and slightly oversteamed. And when he hesitated, she lifted a brow. "You do know how to use the silverware, right?" The question was dropped like a pin between them. The pause hung heavy. Then, with no response, she placed the tray firmly on his table and moved on. Deshawn didn't look up. He sat staring at the small foil-covered dish, the plastic cutlery tucked into a napkin with no logo. He unwrapped it slowly, methodically, trying to find calm and routine. But the fork trembled slightly in his grip. He glanced down the aisle and saw the same attendant laughing with the passengers in row 17, kneeling to offer wine suggestions, as if auditioning for a commercial. No laughter followed him. No questions. No one noticed when he returned his tray untouched. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because he couldn't stomach what it represented. At one point, a child from a few rows up wandered into the aisle and stared at him curiously. The mother called him back with a nervous glance, whispering something that caused the boy to frown and retreat. Deshawn heard it anyway. "Not everyone belongs in front, baby. Sometimes they just get put where there's space." He exhaled slowly, the air sharp in his lungs. His dignity was being whittled down not by overt acts of violence, but by 1,000 silent incisions, a withheld courtesy here, a belittling comment there, the subtle, orchestrated denial of the most basic forms of acknowledgement. His name hadn't been spoken since the gate. His presence had been reduced to a seat number, a misplaced meal order, and a silent judgment held in the expressions of strangers. The cabin grew darker as the plane entered late evening altitude. Lights dimmed to allow rest. A voice over the intercom announced the descent into cruising altitude and the start of the main cabin entertainment system. He had barely touched his meal. His hands were clasped over his lap, his frame tucked inward with the precision of someone trained not to provoke attention. The movie 2 rows up played with its color-muted glow, laughter, and explosions leaking through the cracked seams of the cabin. Deshawn wasn't watching. He was listening. The murmurs, the hushed exchanges, the occasional snort of laughter that didn't bother to mask itself anymore. The row behind him had been quiet until now. But that silence shattered as one man, coughing violently and theatrically, leaned forward and pointed, not at the window, not toward the aisle, but at Deshawn's back. "I'm sorry," the voice said loudly enough to skip pretense, "but is someone wearing something strong? Cologne?" Or he trailed off, making a face as if swatting something invisible in the air. A few others chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that clings to shared assumptions. "It's kinda strong." Just saying. The statement wasn't a question. It was an invitation, an open challenge. Deshawn heard the chuckle from the man's seatmate, followed by a muttered suggestion to notify the flight crew if it got worse. Moments later, the flight attendant reappeared, not the same woman from earlier, but another, taller, with narrowed eyes and a clipboard in her hand. She crouched slightly beside Deshawn's seat and spoke with that hollow, plastic tone perfected through years of customer service. "Sir, we've had a complaint from a nearby passenger regarding an odor." Her words were measured, artificial. "Do you have any strong scents, lotions, sprays, or foods that may be disturbing others?" Deshawn turned slowly, brows tightening, lips parting as if to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, he reached down to his personal bag, opened it calmly, and showed its contents: a laptop, a charger, a folder of printed documents. No food, no sprays, no perfumes. No reply came from the attendant. She reached into her pocket and handed him a small, thinly folded towel and a packet of what looked like scented wipes. "We're just asking everyone to be mindful," she said, already rising, "for the comfort of all passengers." She walked away before he could say anything else. Across the aisle, someone scoffed. "Jesus," they muttered, "it's just common decency." Deshawn's hand clenched the wipe. He didn't open it. He didn't move. But his skin prickled beneath the collar of his shirt, the pressure of eyes on his back undeniable. He had become a spectacle, a lesson, a problem to be managed. A passenger across from him, white, middle-aged, face ruddy with alcohol or altitude or both, grinned and leaned across the aisle. "What do you do, man?" he asked, slurring just slightly. "Like for work." Deshawn looked at him briefly. The man didn't wait for an answer. "Wait, let me guess," he said with a chuckle. "Security? Maybe valet? I know a guy who works for Delta who gets his buddy's flight sometimes. You one of those?" He laughed again, louder this time, and leaned back into his seat with self-satisfaction, as if the assumption was a punchline. The woman next to him rolled her eyes, but didn't speak. No one did. Deshawn blinked slowly, pressing his thumb into his palm beneath the tray table, grounding himself. The seat felt smaller now, tighter. His own body felt like an intrusion. Every breath was calculated, every motion rehearsed. He heard the attendant laughing softly with a passenger 2 rows up. No one offered him water. No one checked his monitor. The wipe remained sealed in his hand. He set it on the tray and folded his arms. The teenager beside him had turned his headphones down, watching the interaction with a slight tilt of his head. He said nothing, but his smirk told Deshawn everything. There were no words needed when silence spoke louder. The air inside the cabin thickened, not from altitude, but from tension left to ferment. The curtains separating first class fluttered slightly as the crew moved back and forth between worlds, one with cloth napkins and champagne, the other with pretense and plastic ridicule. Deshawn sat between them, his seat a pressure chamber of isolation. He glanced out the window. Nothing but clouds and fading light. He reached into his jacket for a pen, uncapped it slowly, and began scribbling faint words in the margins of a pocket-sized notebook he always carried. His attention was fixed inward now, his body a quiet storm of restraint, his breath measured with each passing minute. It had been nearly 2 hours since the plane left the runway, and yet each passing moment only tightened the vice of humiliation that had clamped around his existence from the moment he stepped through the first-class threshold. He had hoped the worst had passed. He had been wrong. The curtains separating classes opened again, and the same tall flight attendant from earlier emerged with clipped steps, her expression stiff. She paused beside his row and leaned down, tone soft in that particular way meant to disguise escalation. "Sir," she said with mock courtesy, "we're going to ask if you'd be willing to relocate to 29F, just for the remainder of the flight." Deshawn blinked once, slowly. "A passenger in 21A," she continued, "has requested more privacy. He's a light sleeper, and we're trying to accommodate comfort for everyone." The way she said it, the implication laced between the lines, sounded rehearsed, deliberate. Comfort. For everyone. Deshawn asked calmly if 29F was closer to the restroom. The answer was yes. He asked whether his current seat had violated any safety guideline. The answer was no. He asked whether he was required to move. She hesitated, just a beat too long, before her smile faltered. Then she lowered her voice. "Refusal to comply with a cabin crew request," she said, "can be considered a disruption to flight operations. I would prefer not to escalate." The words landed like a warning, cloaked as suggestion. Deshawn didn't respond right away. He stared at her, unblinking, his silence louder than protest. The other passengers around him had begun to watch. Again, their eyes dragged across his skin like weight, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled expectation. He felt their hunger for resolution, not justice, for quiet, not fairness. Before he could decide, movement from row 20 caught his eye. A woman, blonde, thin-lipped, her pearls glinting in the low light, turned around fully in her seat, twisting at the waist. She fixed him with a long, unbroken stare, the kind that did not question, the kind that judged. She then reached into her handbag, pulled out a white medical mask, and slipped it over her face with ceremonial care. The gesture was slow, theatrical. As she adjusted the straps, she drew a small perfume bottle from her coat pocket and spritzed it once into the air, then again, closer to her shoulder. The scent bloomed in the narrow aisle like accusation. "Just making sure the air's breathable back here," she said flatly, voice pitched to Carrie, smiling behind the fabric as she settled into her seat again. Several passengers chuckled. One shook his head as if watching a scene he had already seen too many times. Another leaned sideways to whisper into a neighbor's ear, both of them glancing toward Deshawn without shame. The flight attendant still stood there, unmoved, saying nothing to the woman who had just performed this public sanitization of the air. Instead, she returned her gaze to Deshawn and repeated her offer. He said nothing. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitened. His body remained locked in place, unmoving, like a monument to every quiet act of endurance that had ever been demanded of men like him. After another tense beat, she exhaled sharply, scribbled something onto her notepad, and walked away without a word. The overhead light flicked on above seat 29F near the rear galley, casting a dim glow onto the space he was now expected to occupy. Closer to the restroom, closer to the service cart, closer to the place where passengers were offered tissues but not titles. He remained seated. He would not move. A nearby attendant, junior in age and posture, watched the interaction unfold but said nothing. The boy in the window seat beside him pulled his hoodie over his head and sank into the side wall, as if to disappear. The ambient cabin music resumed faintly over the speaker system, a soft piano meant to lull passengers into forgetting discomfort. Deshawn heard every note as an insult. His seat was now radioactive. No one made eye contact. No one intervened. The crew walked past him with the urgency of people evading spilled coffee. The flight crew no longer approached him, not to offer water, not to check service, not to ensure his basic comfort. Their glances slid past him like a stain they had decided could not be scrubbed. But others on the plane had begun to notice, at first with the same passive discomfort that people often carry when witnessing injustice from a safe distance. Now, though a different passenger, a woman in her late 20s, seated diagonally behind Deshawn in 22C, had taken out her phone, tilted it subtly, and began recording. She had watched it all unfold, the relocation, the wipe, the forced suggestion to move again, the spray of perfume, and that passive-aggressive mask. She hadn't spoken, but something about the stillness of Deshawn's defiance compelled her. Her hands trembled slightly as she captured the scene. One man, still and silent, surrounded by everything but dignity. Within seconds, a male flight attendant noticed the phone. His reaction was swift and disproportionate. He marched down the aisle and leaned toward the woman, speaking low but sharp. "You need to delete that. Filming other passengers violates airline policy." She responded that she was documenting what looked like targeted mistreatment. He raised his hand, palm out. "Delete it, or you'll be removed when we land." She paused. "He's done nothing wrong," she said quietly, gesturing toward Deshawn, who now turned his head, aware of the escalation. The attendant's voice rose ever so slightly. "Final warning. I'm notifying the captain. If the recording continues, we'll make an unscheduled landing for a security breach." The word echoed. Security breach. Not behavior. Not violence. Not noise. A phone. A camera. A truth. The woman's defiance cracked beneath the weight of threat. She tapped her screen, pulled up the video, and pressed delete. The attendant hovered until she showed him the trash folder. The file gone. "Thank you," he said curtly and walked off. The woman sank back into her seat, shame blooming across her face. She glanced at Deshawn, her eyes wide with apology she couldn't say aloud. He didn't look away. He gave the faintest nod. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Across the intercom, a sudden tone rang out, followed by a new voice, this time from the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical delay. We'll be holding altitude for a short period due to an onboard security concern. Please remain seated. We'll update you shortly." The words fell like ash over the cabin. People looked around, confused. A security concern? What concern? No one had moved. No alarms had sounded. The plane had been calm, aside from the subtle but unmistakable tension centered in one aisle. But now, because of a phone and a truth someone tried to capture, the flight was stalling. Whispers began to circulate, speculative and unkind. "What happened?" a man in 17A asked. "Someone try something?" murmured a woman in 18C. "That guy," another whispered, nodding, not subtly, toward Deshawn. "He hasn't moved since takeoff." "Maybe that's why," the man replied. "Too quiet. Makes people nervous." Within minutes, a pair of uniformed flight marshals emerged from behind the curtain near the cockpit. Their suits were corporate but crisp, with discreet communication devices in their ears. They didn't walk with urgency, but with presence, just enough to amplify the notion of threat. They stopped near row 21, spoke briefly to the crew, then turned toward Deshawn's seat. One of them crouched slightly, leaned in, and said, "Sir, we'd like to ask a few questions." The entire row around him fell into a hush. The couple across the aisle froze mid-sentence. The boy in the hoodie adjusted his seat, but avoided all eye contact. The woman who had recorded earlier held her breath. "Is there a problem?" Deshawn asked, voice level. "No problem," the marshal replied, "just protocol. Some confusion about passenger activity in your section. We'd like to clarify, then we'll be on our way." Clarify. A word that sounded like courtesy, but operated like containment. Deshawn kept his tone even. "I haven't moved. I haven't spoken. I haven't raised my voice. What clarification do you need?" The marshal didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the galley, suggesting a private conversation. Deshawn declined. "If there's a matter of protocol," he said calmly, "you're welcome to ask here in public. I have nothing to hide." The standoff lasted only a moment, but it spoke volumes. Eventually, the marshal relented and stepped back. "Understood. Thank you for your cooperation." And they left. No apology, no resolution, just presence and pressure, then retreat. The cabin remained frozen, its atmosphere now charged with implications. Deshawn sat unmoved, his posture perfect, eyes forward. He had not caused a delay. He had not recorded anyone. He had not raised his voice. But his body, his silence, his refusal to disappear, these had been enough to label him a disruption. That moment arrived just past the halfway point of the flight, when most passengers had dozed off or slipped into bored distraction, their headphones cradling them in noise and ignorance. Deshawn, however, sat upright, fully alert, his gaze still fixed beyond the frosted window, but his attention now turning inward with cold precision. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. From his inner jacket pocket, he retrieved a slim black leather phone, not the same commercial model most passengers carried, but a government-grade, encrypted device with no external branding. He powered it on, navigated quickly through the authentication process, and pressed a single button labeled G. The screen flashed once. The call connected. A deep male voice answered on the other end, but Deshawn spoke only 7 words, clear and steady. Activate compliance protocol. Asset ID, Indigo 1. The line went dead 2 seconds later. He powered the device down, returned it to his jacket, then reached into his briefcase and extracted a small leather folder, black with silver embossing. He opened it and placed the identification card within, featuring a federal crest, a biometric chip, and the words National Infrastructure Oversight, Executive Tier, on the tray table in front of him. The card shimmered faintly beneath the overhead light. At first, no one noticed. But energy travels fast at 30,000 feet. Within minutes, a signal relayed from cockpit to crew. A light blinked on the internal crew panel with a code rarely used. Level red clearance, cross-check identity 1A. Inside the galley, the purser froze mid-sentence, rereading the code. Her face drained of color. She excused herself and walked, stiff-legged, toward the forward service phone. A second call was made, not to the flight deck, but directly to a number stored for emergencies only. When she returned, her walk was different, faster, more deliberate. She headed straight toward row 21. Deshawn hadn't moved. He saw her coming, but didn't meet her eyes. She crouched beside him, voice suddenly quiet, reverent. "Mr. Knox," she said, almost a whisper, "please forgive the earlier disruptions. We weren't aware of your designation." Her words cracked at the edges, like someone reciting from a manual they hoped never to open. She continued, "Is there anything I can do to correct the experience?" Deshawn looked at her for the first time, long and hard, his eyes unreadable. Then he turned slowly toward the window again, letting the silence speak louder than any reply. The purser hesitated, then stood, gestured subtly to the junior flight attendant nearby. The young woman's face contorted in confusion as she was pulled aside. Whispered words were exchanged. Her eyes darted toward Deshawn. She blanched. She turned away. A ripple passed through the crew, subtle but unmistakable. They had been told. Not what he did, not how, just who he was. And that was enough. Soon after, a message arrived for the captain. A note, handwritten by the purser, delivered by hand to the flight deck. No intercom announcement followed. No apology was made aloud. But within minutes, the behavior of the entire crew shifted like tide. The curtain to first class was opened without explanation. The passenger manifest was suddenly rechecked. The attendants began moving with frantic subtlety, preparing a seat that had moments ago been declared unavailable. Deshawn sat still. He did not stand. He did not move to reclaim what had once been his. He remained in 21B, arms crossed, watching the facade collapse around them. The passenger in 21A, who had requested Deshawn be moved earlier, now leaned forward slightly, glancing at the ID badge still resting on the tray. His smirk faded. He didn't ask questions. The woman with the perfume mask had removed it quietly, sometime during the shift. She stared straight ahead now, still and pale. One by one, the silent alliance of passengers, those who had once nodded, whispered, judged, now avoided all eye contact, unsure whether shame or fear held their tongues. A stewardess approached from the front, different from the ones before. She was older, composed, and wore the insignia of flight administration. "We've prepared your original seat, sir," she said, voice low. "You'll find your belongings already arranged. I'll personally ensure you're not disturbed." Deshawn turned slowly, met her eyes, then spoke his first full sentence in over 2 hours. "I'll stay here." The words dropped like a stone in a shallow pond. She blinked. "Sir." He nodded once. "Ears fine." She paused, nodded respectfully, and stepped back. No pressure. No protocolo override. The message had been delivered. The damage had already been done, and he had no interest in being escorted back to comfort as if it were a prize. Deschamps looked again at the ID card, then closed the leather case and slipped it back into his briefcase. A new message had just come through, tagged Priority 1. Its subject line read only 4 words: Ethics Review, Immediate Termination. She opened it, scanned the content once, then again, and her lips parted slightly in shock. There was no room for misinterpretation. The message was not directed at the flight crew. It was addressed to corporate. It stated, with finality, that the deal between Halvix Airlines and the Indigo Infrastructure Consortium, projected at $2.3 billion in shared international expansion, was officially withdrawn. The reason cited was clear: systemic failure in bias compliance protocols and verified misconduct by senior staff on a test flight. The decision, the message explained, had been signed off by the Indigo chair himself, an individual whose identity had been protected throughout the negotiation. That chair was now sitting silently in 21B. The purser swayed slightly on her feet, as if gravity had thickened, then looked down the aisle toward Deschamps, who remained still, watching the clouds with a gaze colder than the air at 30,000 feet. She tapped a single key on the device, routing the message to the encrypted channel of the flight director and to Halvix Executive Operations. Then she closed the tablet, tucked it away, and braced for what she knew was coming next. Meanwhile, back at corporate headquarters in Chicago, the boardroom erupted. Screens across the long table flashed red as the emergency feed linked in live. The CEO's face drained of color. He had known about the audit flight, Indigo's practice of sending unidentified executive agents as passengers to evaluate partnership integrity. But he had not expected them to use this flight. Not this day. Not that man. Legal heads began flipping through printed versions of the Diversity Compliance Pledge signed 3 months prior. HR leads began preparing statements. It was already too late. Back on the aircraft, the captain received a discreet knock at the cockpit door. A sealed message had been delivered via satellite relay from the control tower. Respect all executive tier protocols. Flight 774 is now under oversight lockdown. Expect direct debrief upon landing. The captain read it twice, said nothing to his co-pilot, and resumed course, but a hard swallow betrayed what he understood. This was no longer a routine flight. This was fallout in motion. Inside the cabin, the change rippled slowly, invisibly at first. Deschamps said nothing. He hadn't moved since the quiet rejection of his first-class seat. But now, those around him began to feel the weight of what had shifted. The young attendant who had once delivered the wipe now approached with trembling hands and a folded blanket, not because he had asked, but because someone had told her. She placed it over his lap gently, her mouth forming a quiet, "I'm sorry," that never found voice. He didn't acknowledge it. The woman with the perfume mask had stopped pretending to read. Her book lay open but untouched on her lap, her eyes locked forward as though waiting for the cabin wall to crack open and swallow her. The man across the aisle, the one who had joked about Deschamps' profession, stared at his own knees, fists clenched, face flushed with something between shame and fear. Word spread quickly in small spaces. The crew knew. The purser knew. The front office knew. And though the passengers were not given the details, the energy shift was palpable. Conversations died down. No more jokes. No more whispers. Everyone became painfully aware of the silence they had filled with assumptions. The mask of luxury had cracked, and beneath it, something raw and irreversible now stared back. 10 rows ahead, in first class, the older couple who had taken Deschamps' original seat were asked by the purser if they would be willing to return to their originally booked seats in premium economy. The woman's face stiffened, and her husband responded with a flurry of questions. Confusion etched across his brows. The purser did not argue. She simply stated that they were guests on an audit-designated flight and that their reassignment was non-negotiable. The couple complied without further complaint. When they passed Deshawn on the way back, their eyes flickered downward, unable to meet his. He didn't turn to watch. He already knew, not who they were, but who they weren't. An hour passed before the captain made another announcement, this one carefully worded. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your continued cooperation. Upon landing, there will be a brief pause for official review. Please remain seated until instructed. The intercom clicked off. No one asked questions. The passengers could feel the weight of something larger than turbulence pressing on them. In seat 21B, Deshawn reached for his briefcase, opened it, and removed a small notebook bound in blue leather. He flipped to a page already half filled with annotations, names, times, phrases spoken. At the bottom, in sharp ink, he wrote one final sentence: observed failure at all operational levels. Deshawn remained seated in 21B, unmoved, composed, staring out the window with the stillness of a man who had already landed in a different truth. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but unnaturally rehearsed, instructing all passengers to remain seated upon arrival due to procedural review. The phrase sounded clinical, but beneath it ran something sharper, final. When the wheels touched down, a soft tremor passed through the fuselage, not from the landing itself, but from what was about to unfold. The plane taxied slowly to a remote part of the airfield, far from the terminal gates, far from waiting families and cameras and the soft tones of boarding music. This was not a routine disembarkation. This was containment. Outside on the tarmac, 3 black SUVs idled near the service stairs, flanked by a small team of airport security officers, 2 federal compliance agents, and 1 individual in a slate-gray suit holding a sealed folder. They did not speak. They were not here for questions. Inside the cabin, the purser stood at the front, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She didn't speak. She knew what was coming. A quiet tone chimed overhead, and the doors unlocked, not by crew, but by external override. 2 uniformed men boarded first, walking with purposeful silence to the center of the aircraft. They did not glance at passengers. They moved only toward the rear galley, where the purser and 2 senior attendants had been waiting. One agent whispered something inaudible. Then, without fanfare, they turned and gestured. The 3 crew members stepped forward. The purser paused only once, looking down the aisle toward Deshawn, her expression unreadable. Then she continued walking, hands loose at her sides, stripped to posture. The passengers watched in complete silence as the once authoritative figures of the flight disappeared through the service door without a single announcement, a single defense, or a single word. The cabin lights flickered once, and the junior flight crew stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or stay. They were eventually instructed by the marshals to resume their posts, but not to speak unless spoken to. The message was clear: authority no longer belonged to them. As ground crews finished inspections and released the aircraft to terminal access, other communications triggered. Inside Halvix Airlines corporate HQ red level system locks had already deactivated a series of employee IDs, permanently terminating access to operation systems, scheduling platforms, and benefits accounts for 6 individuals identified by the audit report. Among them, the purser, the attendant who issued the hygiene wipe, the male staff member who threatened the passenger filming, and the flight director who had rerouted Deshawn's original seat. Not suspensions, terminations, full and final. Within the first hour of landing, a second wave of action struck. The airline's elite member database processed revocations for 4 frequent flyer accounts. 3 of the individuals had issued direct complaints about Deshawn's presence. 1 had laughed during his interrogation. Their tier status was revoked indefinitely. Their privileges, lounge access, complimentary upgrades, early boarding, were suspended. A statement would be sent within 24 hours, but the system update had already executed. At the airport, as passengers finally stood to disembark, an eerie hush still coated the cabin. No one rushed to retrieve bags. No one reached for their phones. No one joked. They filed out slowly, heads bowed, eyes flicking toward 21B, but unable to hold their gaze. As they exited, each passenger passed two uniformed compliance agents quietly recording faces and matching them against a manifest. Not for punishment, but for verification. It was protocol, nothing more. And yet it felt like penance. Deshawn waited until the aisle was almost empty before standing. He did not hurry. He took his time placing the briefcase back into his hand, adjusting his coat, smoothing the cuffs of his sleeves. He did not acknowledge the attendant waiting near the exit, though she opened her mouth slightly as if to speak. He passed by her without pause, his silence louder than any rebuke. Outside, the morning light touched the tarmac in shades of dull gold. He descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, stepping from a manufactured world of airline civility into the harsher, cleaner truth of consequence. The man in the slate gray suit stood near the third SUV, nodding once as Deshawn approached, then opening the back door without a word. Deshawn entered, closed the door, and the vehicle rolled forward, moving steadily away from the aircraft that had, for 6 hours, become a battlefield of identity, judgment, and unspoken hierarchy. The SUV drove past terminals and hangars, turning toward a private terminal reserved for dignitaries and federal use. No cameras, no press, just aftermath. Behind them, the crew gathered for debriefings that none of them had prepared for. HR officials had already flown in. Compliance investigators were waiting in small rooms with soundproof walls and sharpened pens. Across the country, a ripple effect had begun. Airline unions received early alerts. Newsrooms heard whispers. Internal emails were leaked by early afternoon. And every employee involved in Flight 774 service roster was now flagged for mandatory ethics retraining, assuming they hadn't already been dismissed. 6 months later, in a studio bathed in soft lighting and subdued tones of repentance, the world sat watching as one woman faced the weight of everything she had done. On a nationally televised segment known for its raw confessions and public reckonings, Brielle Harper, the former flight attendant who had once passed silent judgment from 30,000 feet, sat nervously in a charcoal blazer, her eyes rimmed red, her voice cracking under the pressure of memory. Across from her, the interviewer leaned in gently, reading from the timeline of Flight 774, now infamous as the flight that had cost a corporation billions and forced an industry to confront its own rot. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, though the question needed no preamble. Brielle swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "I thought I was following protocol," she said at first, but the words felt flimsy even to her. Then, after a long pause, her eyes lifted to the camera. "No, that's not the truth. The truth is, I saw him and made assumptions. I believed I was being professional, but I was being prejudiced. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. That's the worst part." Her voice faltered as she continued. "It was unconscious. It was automatic. But it was wrong. And I live with that shame every day." The camera cut to a quiet audience, members of the public, young aviation students, industry leaders, and then returned to her. "I lost my job, my reputation. But more than that, I lost the right to pretend I understood fairness. I didn't. Not until I saw that man walk off that plane without anger, without violence. Just silence. And that silence screamed louder than anything I'd ever heard." The interview continued, but the world had already heard enough. They had seen the footage. They had read the investigative reports. They had watched the cultural fallout ripple across boardrooms and policies. What they hadn't seen, until now, was what came after. Meanwhile, in a bright auditorium in Atlanta, hundreds of students, many of them young, many of them black, all of them hopeful, sat forward in their chairs as a tall figure took the stage. He wore a navy suit, his walk calm, his expression composed but warm. His name, now fully public, was no longer just whispered among federal circles or known in investment columns. Marcus Allen, business magnate, philanthropist, former federal ethics auditor, and the man whose unacknowledged seat on Flight 774 had changed the course of an entire industry. He stepped to the podium, looked out at the crowd, and smiled, Not the tight, restrained smile of a man weathering indignity, but the quiet, resolute smile of someone who knew exactly who he was, and who was now using that truth to lift others. 6 months ago, he began. I sat on a plane and watched a system reveal itself, not because it wanted to, but because it couldn't help itself. What happened wasn't rare. What made it powerful was that this time someone was watching, and this time the person being watched could do something about it. The room was still, hanging on each word. I could have sued, he said. I could have walked away with a settlement, a statement, a moment. But moments fade. Impact doesn't. Then he gestured toward the banner behind him. The Allen Initiative for Aviation Access. That's why today, he continued, we are launching a full scholarship program for 1,000 students of color to receive full training, licensing, and placement in the aviation industry. Pilots, engineers, flight directors, ground control, real opportunity. Because justice isn't revenge, it's transformation. Applause erupted, not from ceremony, but from genuine awe. In the crowd, some students cried. Some clapped until their hands hurt. A few simply stood, their bodies trembling from the weight of what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to belong. After the event, reporters tried to press Marcus for comment. They wanted details about the lawsuit that had never been filed, about the executive board shakeups at Hostility Airlines, about his decision to remain quiet during the flight. He responded with only one sentence. Sometimes, the most powerful protest is the refusal to descend to the level of those trying to break you. Later that week, Hostility Airlines quietly released its own video, a 6-minute apology featuring new leadership, revised policy frameworks, and an open invitation for outside audit. The airline had lost its deal, its reputation, and half its board, but now sought something more difficult: accountability. They credited the independent review for inspiring sweeping reforms in unconscious bias training, promotion protocols, and diversity investment. But everyone watching knew none of it would have happened if Marcus Allen hadn't sat down and chosen not to move. Not just physically, but morally. In the months that followed, other airlines began reaching out to the Allen Initiative. Other industries took note. Something had shifted, not because Marcus had forced it, but because his stillness had made the world uncomfortable enough to finally move. Back in her small apartment in Detroit, Brielle watched the scholarship event replay on her television. Her eyes filled with tears again, not because of guilt alone, but because the man she had once overlooked had chosen not to erase her in return. She had written him a letter months ago, a letter of apology. She never knew if he read it, but seeing what he had built in response to what she helped break told her something deeper. He had moved beyond punishment. He had chosen purpose, and that choice had changed her too. She enrolled in a local university studying behavioral psychology. She started volunteering at a youth mentorship program. She never returned to the skies, but now she helped others rise. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives that reveal truth and justice in unexpected ways. What part of the story struck you the hardest? Was it the silent resistance, the sudden turn of power, or the transformation at the end? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your comment below and be part of the conversation.